So are you curious to hear my top 5 common houseplants that I would under no circumstances be repurchasing and adding back into my collection? This might get a bit spicy. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So yes, today is a continuation of the little mini-series that I was doing earlier on this week, and I'll link the video at the top there. I did a video of my top 5 plants that I would repurchase that are common houseplants and add into whatever house or collection I might have at any given time based on my personal experiences with those plants. This is now its sister video, which is the opposite side of that spectrum. Now I will say the same caveats that I did in the other one. These are my own personal opinions. Please do not take any personal offense to this if I talk about any of your favorite plants. These have just been my experiences with these plants, and this is why they made the list. If you do disagree, however, do let us all know down below in the comments and maybe share what your conditions and how you've cared for these plants are. In case anybody does want to try them, they can see what has worked for you. But without further ado, let's dive into the first one. So starting off strong with the viral beauty that was, and I'm talking about quite a few years ago now, at least 5 or 6 years ago, the Pilea peperomioides. And spoiler, I don't have any of these plants anymore in my collection for obvious reasons. This is one that I will give it its credit. So barring the frenzy that happened, this was one of those plants that also had a cute story behind it. People couldn't get it. They were talking about what the little cute story was, that there was a nanny at some point in a family in Norway, and she got a section of this plant from the, or she was in a pair, and she got a section of this plant from the family of the kid that she was caring for, and she grew it, and it was quite a successful plant for her, and she got bits and cuttings and gave to friends, and it became like the friendship plant, I think, or something along those lines. So there's a cute story to go behind the Pilea peperomioides. However, the reality, and it is a very stunning plant because you don't get a lot of plants that have those kind of disc-shaped leaves, but I want to kind of hearken to your attention those petioles. So what's attaching those coin-shaped leaves to the main central stem of that plant, and they can get quite wide. So this is a plant that won't get absolutely sprawling. It's not a crawler, so you're okay in that respect, but it does get quite wide and quite columnar. It's also a plant that I found is super easy to etiolate, and by that I mean it starts leaning heavily towards the light. So part of the reason why this plant makes it into that list is because it's a bit more high maintenance than I want to care for a plant that just gives me that look, basically. Because in order to keep it as straight up and down as you would like to with this type of plant, you definitely need to remember every single time that you water to do a quarter turn, so that, especially if it's in a window, so that it doesn't start leaning heavily towards one location and you just get a really wonky plant. I'll add to that the fact that if you do get a wonky plant, because of the way that it grows, it starts really becoming top heavy and really wanting to topple over. So it's not the most stable plant, and I'm talking about years down the line. With any of these common house plants, I'm thinking of your future conditions and your future care and the future adjustments that you're going to have to make with these plants. So as I said, this is one that will kind of tend to tilt. It will sprawl across a wider area than necessarily its pots sometimes. And the other thing that you need to remember about this plant is the smallest knock whilst you're walking past this plant, especially if it starts getting huge, it will snap one of those leaves. And if you snap enough of those leaves, it starts looking odd because there will never be another leaf to fill in that gap. And this plant is beautiful. If you can do all of the things and keep it pristine, again, another reason why this plant is on here, because if it is pristine and you are the type of person who would love to keep your plants perfect, this might be a good option. But for the people that don't want to fuss that much because they don't want to have a perfect plant, this is a plant that, again, maybe it's just an aesthetic thing for me. The moment that it starts looking a bit off and you've dropped half of the leaves off and you don't have that cohesive kind of disc-shaped leaves all the way kind of solidly around this plant is the moment it starts looking a bit wrong. It starts looking like, oh, this is not a great example of this plant. And then you're stuck with a plant that you've been caring with for years and it doesn't look its best. Looks is one of the big things on this and a bit of care. On the flip side, I will give this plant its credit. It's not a particularly difficult plant in terms of its care need. It doesn't need high humidity necessarily. The watering conditions for this is not particularly difficult. It does get some weird growth sometimes at the soil level, and people have experienced it. It's something that looks a bit like a fin, and it's an interesting plant. It does, in every way and form, it doesn't look like a plant from this world. So I'm a huge sci-fi fan and I've played a lot of video games in my life. If I saw a plant like this in one of my kind of sci-fi video games or even read about something that looked like this in a sci-fi book, I wouldn't blink twice because it can look a bit alien. So there is that going for it. But for all the reasons that I mentioned, so the fact that it can look a bit busted quite easily, the fact that it can get a bit tall and a bit odd looking after a while, this is a hard pass for me. I would not have this in my collection. Shall we move on to an Alocasia now? So the Alocasia Black Velvet. And I've got things to say about this plant. And again, this is all a personal preference because I know that there's not going to be an awful lot of people that agree with me. But as I said at the beginning of this video, these are my opinions. So I don't think for the level of fussiness that this plant can give you and how slow it is, that it's worth the care that it needs in order to look like that, basically. Because yes, it is a darker plant, so I get that people like that, and it is a darker, more velvety looking plant. I will say this, I think it's been a while since I've owned one, but I don't think the texture when you feel it actually feels velvety. It looks velvety, but it's not velvety, if that makes sense. And for me, there's better plants that kind of have more unusual texture, especially with alocasias. When you look at something like a dragon scale, there's so many, that's one that comes straight to mind, but there are so many interesting textured leaved alocasias out there rather than the black velvet. And to me, it grew really slowly. It had a lot of issues. I couldn't keep it happy. The watering requirements for it, and generally I don't do particularly well with jewel type alocasias, the smaller alocasias. I do great with the big ones. But this one I found out of all of them just needed so much fussing and you still couldn't necessarily get it right. And I have heard this from some people. It's not just my experiences. But I do also know that a lot of people like the look of this plant, and I get that. And as I said, I was drawn to it for similar reasons, but maybe the reason that this plant is on here is because I was always a bit meh about this plant. I'm just like, I get it, and I get the hype, and I can kind of understand that this is a thing that people want. But I never really was just like, I must desperately try to grow this plant. My day would not be complete if I did not have this plant to care for. No, I was nowhere near that level of interested in this plant. And it probably didn't help with the lack of patience that I had for this plant, because I'm just like, the payout for me is a bit blah. It's a bit beige. I know it's not beige, but you know what I mean. It's a difficult one to get excited for, and for the level of care that it needs, for me, this is a hard pass. This is a hard pass. Again, I know that there's going to be people out there that love this plant and have cared for this plant successfully. Share down below. Tell us what you do differently with this plant and why you've had good experiences with it. The next one's, I don't think it's going to be specifically spicy, but I think this is going to be one that a lot of people might agree. String of anything. And I know that's not one plant, it's multiple plants, but string of bananas, string of dolphins, string of tears, string of pearls, string of hearts, a string of anything. And I know all of those plants aren't necessarily even that closely related to each other, but string of anything. No, 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 no. This dude here does not want to spend half of his time unpicking and untangling things. If, however, you are the type of individual, there is no shame, by the way, to this. If you are the type of individual that looks forward to Christmas and Christmas decorations specifically because you want to spend hours untangling the Christmas lights, string of anything is going to be your jam. It's going to be your jam. You're going to get to do that a lot. You're going to get to do that a lot. And also for a lot of them, and I'm going to put the string of hearts to one side for the moment. It's more the string of bananas, string of dolphins, string of tears, string of pearls, all of those types of strings, the more succulent type strings of something. They can be quite challenging with their watering, they can be quite challenging with their light needs, they can be quite challenging barring the untangling, the fact that if you do a few things wrong you might lose half of those leaves, there's no new leaves that are going to grow on that string of whatever, on that stem. So you're left with like big barren sections. They are one of these things that your heart will sink to the damn floor every time you pass it and even vaguely nudge it or forbid that you drop the plant. Your stomach will just drop to the floor at that point because the vast reality is it might have taken you years to get a decent length on that plant, and within a split second of clumsiness, you will lose all of that. Yes, I hear you before you say it, that you could use the chopped up bit or the bit that's snapped off to propagate it and put it back in the pot. Oh. Just a hard no for me because, again, it's not even necessarily that they are unusual, do not get me wrong. How many plants are you ever going to look like? And again, it's one of those things that you need to squint hard enough to see it. Like the string of dolphins, I think is the most interesting thing because it does look a bit like a dolphin. String of bananas, I get it. I get it. String of tears, string of pearls, God forbid that you get a string of anything that is variegated. Whatever I just said, exponentially increase the difficulty. Exponentially increase the difficulty. Because if those plants aren't particularly forgiving with their light and water needs, if they're variegated versions of that plant, you are literally walking on a knife edge. At any given time, you will go from a happy, healthy looking plant to either mush or dust. So, can you tell I'm a bit spicy about this one? But again, it was one of those plants that a lot of people got into. Little side note here, a little kind of side story here. For a lot of people that have kind of said, okay, you know what, we never really got and understood the aroid craze, and everybody was into philodendrons, everybody was into anthuriums, everybody was into monsteras, like all of these things, and they're just like, why? And that's really annoying. My humblest 2 cents on this is I think because a lot of us when we were first starting off, especially people that have been doing it for years, didn't necessarily go straight into aroids. We went into these types of plants, the strings of, and all of these other different varieties where they can be quite challenging. And that put us off enough of having to spin all these different plates to not want to do that. To go for something that's a bit more reliable and a bit more stable. Not saying that all aroids are either reliable or stable, but by and large, they are less needy as a whole than some of these plants can be. So that's my 2 cents on that one. That might be part of the reason, one of the reasons why people moved more towards aroids is a bit more of that consistency. But yeah, string of anything? No, 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 no. The next one on this list is any form of Pilea. And I know there was the Pilea peperomioides before. I know that's a Pilea technically, but that, to me at least, is very different from what most people would consider a Pilea to look like. Some examples here. Now, there's a reason why they made this list, and it's because when you're first starting off and you're going to garden centers or plant stores and things like that, and you don't want to try some of the things that look a bit more challenging, you will probably be gravitating towards this plant because, again, a lot of them look different. They look unusual. They look out of this world. Actually saying that, I've only just made the connection. It's not just the Pilea peperomioides. A lot of the Pileas do look a bit alien. And you would go for those types of plants. You'd go for these types of Pileas. Now, in my humblest of experiences, are they easy to grow? Relatively, yes. You can do relatively well with these plants. However, the issue that you get with this plant is when invariably you do okay with them, especially if you're not growing them in a terrarium. The only exclusion to this commentary that I'm going to do now is if you're growing these in a terrarium, great. Keep doing you. That is a great way to grow these plants. However, if you are growing them in regular household conditions and you are keeping everything perfect and you're keeping them happy, again, not a particularly challenging plant type to grow, but the moment that you're doing well with these plants is the moment that they start growing. Understandably, what do plants do when you're giving them exactly the right level of care that they need? Is they grow. And that's the problem with these plants, is they grow, they never get super, super tall, but boy oh boy do they start looking lanky. They're very stemmy, they don't have that many leaves. Unlike, as I said, this is why I'm giving this its own category versus the Pilea peperomioides. They start looking really scraggly. And yes, you could chop them back down. And if you do treat these types of plants more like garden plants and you start pinching them off very low down so they can bush out a bit more, yes, you could do that. But again, it's an extra step that a lot of people really don't want to fuss with. But yeah, that's my big thing. Not necessarily against the Pileas, but something that doesn't make me ever want to retry Pileas is that they just generally look a bit scraggly when they get older. They start looking really spindly, really kind of like you've done something wrong with the plant. And the irony is you haven't. You have pretty much done everything right with that plant, and that's the way that it looks. But at least visually to a lot of us, it looks like something's gone wrong along the way, which is it's a bit of the annoying thing, because I'll give you an example. If you've got friends coming around, if you care about these things, not everybody does, but if you've got friends coming around, they'll be like, you say that you're good with the house plants. Like, why is that one looking busted? And it's just like, no, I promise. I've done the right things with this plant. It just looks like that. This is what it looks like when you do the right things. Do you know what I mean? So it's a slightly challenging plant in that respect. So for the fact that even when you do everything right, the default view of this plant is to look a bit scraggly and a bit lanky and a bit like this, it's really not for me. If I will say this, if I had only a few plants in my house and I had the time to just spend the extra little bit of few minutes of kind of like manicuring this and styling plants as well. So this might work if you're into kind of the concept of bonsais, but you don't want to like bite the bullet with a bonsai and have to do all of that styling and care. This might be an interesting one because you will kind of have to tweak things around in order to make it still look pretty. But yes, for that very specific reason, Pileas as a whole just wouldn't be plants that I'd ever want to re-own. I'd love the look of them. I always get really giddy when I see them in plant stores, but I'm okay to get excited by looking at them somewhere else, looking pristine from the growers, and not touch them. And let's wrap up with a philodendron, which I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to a lot of people, even though I've only just recently got rid of mine that was looking a bit busted right in the back there. The Philodendron brandtianum. On the face of it, this plant, looking at it, would be like, oh, it's a pretty plant. It's a nice plant. It looks a bit like the heartleaf philodendron, and it can be trailing, and it's got those little cute heart-shaped leaves, and it's also silver. Win, 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 all round. So because it's got those silvery leaves, everybody's just like, yes, I must have it. But it does grow like rubbish. It doesn't, as far as I'm aware, even with people that have tried it on moss poles, it doesn't size up necessarily. So that's a big no for a lot of people. And it does get a bit scraggly. It can be really exacting, both in terms of humidity, in terms of like moisture, in terms of light. And it's for that level of spinning plates, and you need to do everything absolutely perfect in order to get this plant to be happy, is one of the big reasons why this plant is on this list for me. Again, I encourage you that if you have owned or still own a Philodendron brandtianum and you've grown it successfully, please do let all of us know, including myself, what you're doing in the comments down below, because I think a lot of us would be quite curious, because I know a lot of people have tried growing this plant and it has grown like rubbish for a lot of people. And it's caused them issues. It causes a lot of care that is very specific, and you're still not getting it right all the time. This is one that can be really, really quite challenging. So I do encourage you, if you can, drop it down below in the comments. I would love to know, as well as everybody else would as well. But yeah, this is not one that I would ever like to re-add to my collection. I know there's going to be some people out there that say that this isn't necessarily a common houseplant where they're based. This has become a lot more common where I am, and it's not particularly expensive either. But I think this is a risky one for a lot of people that maybe don't have an awful lot of experience with plants, because I would imagine this is the type of plant that would put you off plants or owning house plants, especially if this is one of the first plants you're growing and thinking that I really can't do this. This is very, very hard. You probably can. You've just started on expert mode. And even the people that can do the expert mode still struggle with this plant as well. So give yourself some credit. This can be a bit of a challenging plant. Again, based on my humblest of experiences, I am sure that there's going to be differing opinions, and that's what makes our little kind of hobby as interesting as it is. That something that might be challenging for me or a few other people might be a breeze, and it might be a walk in the park for other people. That is absolutely fine. But based on my experiences, the Philodendron brandtianum absolutely would never re-add to my collection or to my home as a houseplant. Beautiful plant to look at when I see it somewhere, but definitely not one that I'm going to be picking up ever again. But yes, what are your thoughts? I'd be very curious to know, because obviously this one feels like a much more negative video. Hopefully I've balanced it out a bit throughout the video and given you the goods and the bads, depending on what your conditions might be like or what your care might be like. But yeah, this is my top 5 list for now. And as I said in my other video with my top 5 ones that I would repurchase, this is not an exhaustive list. I can do more of these videos if you are interested to find out other plants that I have not had the best of experiences with, and maybe ones that I would steer away from. Because ultimately, for me, if we're talking common houseplants, again, based on what everybody's been discussing over the last few months, is you're looking for something that's going to be easy to take care of, quote unquote, a bit of a feral plant, one that you don't have to fuss, one that will still look great without an awful lot of effort, and one that you can grow to a decent size and can become a bit of an heirloom plant. In my humblest of opinion, none of the plants on this list tick any of those boxes. So I had to add them onto this list. It's as simple as that. But yes, as I mentioned throughout this video, do let me know down below if you agree with me on some of these plants. If you disagree, that's great. Maybe tell us why you disagree and what you've done differently down below. And maybe add some of your top 5 kind of plants, common house plants, that you would never consider repurchasing or re-adding to your house or re-adding to your collection because of X, Y, and Z reason. That would be great. I'm really, really curious with this one, because we're all different and we'll all have different likes and dislikes and different things that we will tolerate and other things that we won't tolerate. But yes, I think that's everything I wanted to cover today. Thank you so, so much for your time. Hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.